Hello and welcome to Technically Speaking, a podcast where scientists and engineers come together to chat about a common interest, share knowledge and satisfy some curiosity. I'm Laura, and in this episode I'm joined by Rwayda and Rebecca to talk about COP26 and why scientists and engineers should care about it. Now, I don't know a whole lot about COP26. What I do know is that it's a conference that's organised by the United Nations to talk about climate change and decide on what to do about it, but that's about it. But Rebecca, you're an official observer at COP26, so can you expand on my simple understanding of the climate summit?
Yes, of course I can. So I'm a senior lecturer at Abertay University, and as part of the COP26 conference, what they've done is they've enabled NGOs or non-governmental organisations to be official observers, because it's a very inclusive process and they want to have as many voices and as many opinions as possible to help them in making the decision. So COP26 stands for Conference of the Parties, and this is the 26th year that the Climate Change Conference of the Parties has happened. So when we talk about COP26, in this case, we're talking about the climate change conferences that happen. And it's the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, so the UNFCCC. So all of the people that are signatories to that convention are the parties for the Conference of the Parties. And most of them are nation states. So nearly 200 nations are signatories or parties, but there's some other bodies involved as well. United Nations, World Bank, global charities, all of that kind of thing. So the reason for having these conferences is to negotiate how we move forward to tackle a global challenge. And the global challenge in this case is climate change. So we need to have national contributions, and we need to have a global picture where all the national contributions add up to trying to meet the challenge. And in this case, the challenge is keeping global temperature rise as close to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial global average temperatures. So all of the nations have got to do their nationally determined contributions, and those contributions go to the big jigsaw puzzle of contributions, and globally they need to add up to trying to keep our global temperature down. So we have targets right now, but what we're looking for at COP26 is a really clear picture of the actions that will deliver those targets. So all of the pieces of the puzzle and all of the actions have to come together to have a meaningful kind of trajectory towards keeping that global average temperature rise to 1.5 degrees or as close as possible to it.
Yeah, there's loads to unpack there. I like the idea that everyone's contributing to this sort of jigsaw of actions that will all come together to solve this global challenge. I mean, 1.5 degrees Celsius doesn't sound like a lot, but on a global scale, I guess, trying to figure out how that is and how to unpack that is quite difficult. And I guess we'll get into that a bit more as we go through this conversation. Now, Rwayda, given your background as a lecturer and a civil engineer, what's your interest in COP26?
Basically, the civil engineering industry, as other industries, is changing to accommodate the challenges for the environment we have at the moment. And my role as an academic and a civil engineer is to help guiding the new generation through that change. And that's where my interest for COP26 and similar climate change conferences come. And that's why new generation of civil engineers need to be aware of what's happening globally.
Oh, so I guess that's about investing in the future with the next generation of engineers.
Exactly, it's about extracting the knowledge, moving them through to the next generation.
And passing that knowledge on. It kind of reminds me, it's been a long time since I did my undergraduate degree, and it wasn't in engineering. But part of my undergraduate degree did involve looking at some climate science. I think the module I did was paleoclimatology, and that was looking at how you could see how the climate had changed by looking at the rock record and ice cores and things like that. And there was something in there about how our orbit around the sun affects the climate because it wobbles very slightly. It's a term, I think it's called orbital forcing. But it's been nearly 20 years since I studied this. It makes me sound so old. Back then, no one was entirely sure whether global warming was caused by human activity or whether it was just part of this sort of natural cycle of how the climate has changed over very, very long time scales. Things have changed since then, which is why we are where we are now with COP26. 20 years is a long time to do science.
Yeah, and that's absolutely right, Laura. And I think that, if we would have looked at the received knowledge 20, 30 years ago, there was still really a debate about that anthropogenic or human-induced climate change. But just in the last year, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is really, it's a sort of a research pool. It's a pool of hundreds of scientists globally that come together to give the technical and scientific basis for what's happening to our planet. And in the latest report, their report number 6, they have said that it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land, that widespread and rapid changes in the atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere, and biosphere have occurred as a result of human influence, and that we're now on a really dangerous trajectory of warming. And the thing that's really interesting about that is the amount of evidence behind that statement. And it's also really interesting to think about how strong that statement is, because as scientists, we might be normally expected to think about, from the available evidence, or thinking about couching things in terms where it allows some gray area, because we don't, science is always a moving feast, there's always more to learn. But this statement of unequivocal human influence is the strongest statement, and that's the headline statement for this latest report for the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and that is the body of scientists. And they don't advise nations on what to do about that. They just say, this is the science, and this is the way it's going, and here's the evidence. So scientists have a really important fundamental role to play in, laying the groundwork, the evidence, the ground truth, for then the policymakers coming in and making their decisions. And the reason why COP26 is so historic, it's not just because we're more convinced of the science now. It's so historic because in Paris, you probably heard of the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement was signed at COP21 in 2015. And at that point, all of these parties came together and they decided we're going to have these targets. And 5 years from now, we're going to know how we're going to meet those targets. Well, here we are 5 years from then. And now we have to have action. We need to know how we're going to meet those targets. So all of those decades of science have really created this huge and really important evidence base. It's based on tree rings, on ice cores that go back thousands of years. It's based on reductionist laboratory science and observation of the natural environment. It's got the entire gamut of scientific method and types of evidence backing it up. It's got, digital and analog. It's got modeling and predictions and estimates and monitoring and measurement. It's got everything. So COP26 is really important. It is history in the making. We're basing it on that fundamental science. The fundamental science has been translated into policy and targets and actions. And COP26 in Glasgow is going to really be a testing ground for whether all of the different parties have come together with reasonable suggestions for how they're going to meet their targets with the actions that they're suggesting. So it really does inform the future of our planet, but most importantly, of human existence on this planet. Because if we don't manage to moderate our warming, then it'll be very disastrous for humankind. It won't necessarily mean the end of planet Earth, but it'll be very, very uncomfortable for people to be living on the planet. So we really do have a vested interest in trying to make this work.
That's why we're doing it. The planet has been through ice ages and all sorts. It'll still be here for quite a long time, but it's about humans and what we can do now and what COP26 can achieve towards that. And I mean, COP26 it means different things to different people, I guess.
Since it's involved everybody, is the event is open to public? Well, Rebecca, you mentioned you're an observer. Do you think that would be a good representation for everyone being involved? Presently, we could not fit the whole population of the world into Glasgow, especially with the social distancing.
No, so that's a really good question. They are trying to be inclusive as possible. So there are the UN negotiators and all of those nation states and all of those delegates, and they need to be there for the discussions and for the voting and for all the different pieces that have to happen at these multiple negotiations, multiple voting, multiple kind of conversations. And that's all based on a whole lot of work that's been done by the scientists and the politics and the economists and the social policy people prior to actually coming to COP. So as an official observer, I can actually engage in the conference by going along and being there in person. I can view what's happening. I have a voice, I can have conversations, I can contribute to debate, but I can't vote. So it's only the people that are signatories to the convention that can vote. And they have the ability to agree or disagree the eventual outcomes from COP26. But it's not just the blue zone, the UN zone that's occurring at COP26. There's a green zone as well, which is the public zone. So the geography of the conference and the way it works out is that there's the blue zone, which is official UN territory for the 2 weeks of the conference, and that's at the Scottish Events Campus. And just across the River Clyde at Glasgow Science Centre, that's where the green zone is, and that's the public zone. And there are bookable free tickets to attend events in the public zone. So it is about trying to be as inclusive and get people along. And there's also an awful lot of people who are going to be demonstrating. There's going to be a lot of people that want to have their voice heard in different ways and not through the official conversations that are happening in the UN zone. But also, it's a really accessible conference this year, more than ever before, because, here we are speaking through a digital media, and we've all been teaching and learning and communicating through online presence over the last year and a half. And indeed, COP26 has taken advantage of us all having that capacity to join in online. So there's actually a COP26 YouTube channel, and you can join in and you can at least view what's happening. So anyone anywhere in the world, they don't have to come to Glasgow to understand what's going on at COP. They can tune in to the YouTube channel and other platforms where they'll be able to get news all the time of what's going on.
Oh, that's good to know. Glasgow's not too far from me. It's only a couple of hours on the train, and I am very tempted to go to see what that public access zone will be like and the sort of festival activities that I can imagine would be happening. It sounds like quite a nice atmosphere. But it's also been years since I've been in a public event of that size. So I'm not too sure how I feel about suddenly being surrounded by whole
We do
people.
have to be careful with COVID. They're taking extra measures and extra restrictions. So whereas in previous COPs, they might have been, all crushed into the room so everyone could see as much as possible and maybe standing up around the back and in the aisles, so they could be a part of the audience, even if there wasn't a seat. Of course, we're not doing that this time. They're taking precautions. They're saying, there's a maximum capacity for these spaces. It's a COVID restriction. We're not having standing room only. If there's a seat, you can take it. If there's not a seat, then you have to wait. And so that's even more important to have the online presence, because not everybody's going to get into every room that they want to go into as well.
But also, I think moving around the Glasgow would be difficult because you would be moving by mainly feet because they blocked most of the roads to make sure of the security of and secure passes for the people in the conference. So if you go to Glasgow, prepare to walk a lot because most of the roads are blocked.
I think I'll be wearing comfortable shoes.
Yeah.
I mean, there's going to be 25,000 or more extra people in Glasgow. And actually, a lot of the delegates are staying in Edinburgh or probably further away than you are, Laura. I've heard that some people are staying in London.
Wow.
Because maybe if you're coming from the other side of the world, that's relatively close. I don't know. But I think that, there's a lot of extra people that are going to be around. Some roads are closed. There's going to be disruption. And, with the best will in the world, even if I've got a schedule for what I want to see and be involved in, it might be at capacity and I might not get in. I might not be able to get there through all the people traffic that are around or the other kind of traffic. There might be demonstrations in my way. I'm just really keeping my mind open. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to expect to see until I get there.
Well, maybe I won't go then. Maybe I'll just look it up on YouTube. But so you mentioned that COP26 is about negotiations. You mentioned voting, and I guess that's how the negotiations will conclude, because that's, I guess, how I would do things if I were trying to decide on something. But it's also about climate science. So what exactly are they negotiating?
So actually, the climate science is the basis for it. So the climate science, those observed increases in greenhouse gases, the way in which the concentration of those greenhouse gases has changed since about 1800 is really the critical foundation that is the basis. Now, that's not being negotiated at COP26. The science has been presented, and all of the nations have had an opportunity to respond to the science and the way it's been presented and the wording that's been used to present it. So there's been a right to reply, and there always is with these sort of science reports that are global science reports. So it's like having a critical review process. The different stakeholders get to give their critical review. So that's not being negotiated. What's being negotiated are the actions based on the science. So it's really the socioeconomic and political side of things that's going to come to the fore. Those negotiations are fragile. You know, they're subject to lots of other influences. And so you really need fantastic leadership, really good persuasion skills, and excellent negotiation skills to make a difference. And one of the people that I want to bring to your attention is Christiana Figueres. And she was actually involved in the Paris Agreement, which I mentioned to you just a few minutes ago. So she's an internationally recognized leader on global climate change. She was the executive secretary of this UN Framework Convention on Climate Change from 2010 to 2016. And so that meant that she assumed responsibility for those climate negotiations. And she was really determined to lead the process towards a universal agreement. And she managed to do that in that historic Paris Agreement. So she'd been to previous negotiations, she'd seen them fail, and she was determined to make them work. And part of that was her method of leadership and her method of communication. She could appeal to people's professional and personal aspirations for the future. And I think that ability to think with empathy as a leader, to be an empathetic leader, to be able to relate to people on a personal basis, as well as to understand the business case and the corporate case for actions and decisions is really critical. So she's a real role model. And I mean, I saw her, she was here for the Earthshot Prize in the UK the other day. And I think she's going to be quite a big presence at COP26 as well. And she certainly is a really amazing female leader, and certainly somebody to look up to, I think.
So this is a very impressive set of skills, and as in communication. You kind of mentioned that. Do you think that is related to her background, that skills that she could imply on her negotiations?
Yeah, possibly, because she's actually from Costa Rica, and Costa Rica have a really forward-thinking approach to the environment. They have reversed their degradation of the environment and made it a real success story. I think that she understands. She's got that really, she's got a scientific and technical understanding. She's got a real link to nature and to environment herself. And she's, at an executive level, really understands business practices and policy. So I think that she is just an amazing, sort of leader. And that different way of leading, I wonder if that's something that we should have more of in our world, rather than that really kind of ambitious, kind of power or finance-led kind of approach. I think understanding about the greater good, if you like, understanding about what's right, and understanding about what we can do for each other, rather than in a selfish way for ourselves as an individual or for a nation or for a company. It's about understanding what's right. And I think that she is very good at communicating the importance of that, but also the way in which that opens up opportunities for individuals, corporations, and nations. And that's the really powerful argument that's being made at the moment. If we don't act, we'll lose out. If we do act, we'll find the opportunities and the possibilities. And that really is the argument at the moment. It's about not only doing this because it's right, because it's good, and because it'll help us in the long run, but actually there are opportunities within it. It's good for our economy. It's good for our nations. It's good for people and planet. So I think she's quite good at making that argument.
Wow, that sounds so impressive. It sounds like she's been quite pivotal to all of this. I think you've just found a new hero for me, someone I can aspire to be as a leader, and I guess, as a scientist, because she's saying that because it came from the science and how that interacted with people and place and economics and politics. That's so amazing. And so you said that COP21 was about setting the targets for the global rise in temperature, and Christina Figueres was quite central to that. But COP26 is about negotiating what actions each nation will take. So I guess they're based on science, but are they also based on social and financial aspects as well?
Yeah, absolutely. That's critical. So it's all very well to have a target, but you have to figure out how you're going to get there. And getting there has to be a combination of what's possible and what's practical and what's affordable. So it has to bring in society, economy, and policy, social policy and economic policy. So yeah, the nationally determined contributions mean that every nation is going to make those decisions based on what's practicable and possible and affordable for them. So it really does come down to this nation by nation, and it's social science and economics and politics and all sorts of different aspects that come into it. So yeah, the IPCC is the scientific basis. The scientists present the science. They don't advise on policy, but they do seek responses, as I mentioned before. And based on their science, the governments and their advisors start to seek solutions to define the policy and the actions that they can take and that they will take to meet the targets. So, for example, in the UK, the Climate Change Committee, the CCC, is an independent statutory body, and it was actually formed under the Climate Change Act, which is an act of Parliament that went through in the UK in 2008. And the purpose of the Climate Change Committee is to advise the UK and the devolved governments on emissions targets and how they will report to Parliament on their progress. And they think about how the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions can help prepare for and adapt to the impacts of climate change that are predicted. And as I said, those predictions are much more set in, confident science now than they were perhaps 20 or more years ago. So they provide independent evidence on setting and meeting carbon budgets and preparing for climate change. And they can look at what the governments say that they'll do, and they can critique it. They can be critical of it because they're independent of government. And so they can give us a really good kind of, test the temperature a little bit in terms of what's been suggested and what's likely to make a difference.
I have this image in my head of, I guess the Climate Change Committee is a mix of people that includes scientists, different backgrounds, sort of pulling all this information together, all this really technical, detailed stuff that I've seen people with PhDs delve into the minute details of, and they pull it all together and package it in a way that makes sense to people who haven't spent all that time delving into the details. So people in Parliament.
Yeah, and I mean, we need the technicians at this stage as well, and the scientists, of course we do, because you can't just say, we'll have all these electric vehicles in place in 10 years' time. Do we have the technology? Is it robust? Does the science work? Can we roll it out? Can we do this at scale? You need a whole suite of different individuals to help answer that question. So if your target is replace all diesel engines with electric engines, you actually need to have a whole load of scientific and technical and infrastructure informed people around. So you need people from all sorts of aspects of STEM, science, technology, engineering, all that sort of stuff. You need to be able to do the modeling. You need to be able to work with industry to see, is this, do we have the capacity to actually do this? Are we promising something that's practicable? And if it's not practical now, what do we need to do to make it practical if that's what our target is?
I feel like you're bringing us back to one of our episodes on batteries in electric cars and some of the challenges that we identified with rolling that out as a national infrastructure challenge, and how to mine the lithium. If people want to listen to that, go and look at our back catalogue.
Yeah, so what do you think our roles as scientists and engineer, what should we do to take an action now for a better future?
I think we don't have any choice but to take action. And actually, I think we'll be really behind the curve if we don't do something now. And the great news is that our professions are doing something. So there's already been action. There is action. It's actually ramping up and there's more going on. I would say we probably need to do it a bit faster and a bit better, a bit sooner, but it is beginning to happen. So one example is, the sort of ICE, the Institution of Civil Engineers State of the Nation report, the routes to net zero that have been developed by our professional bodies, but also by many of the environmental consultants and engineering consultancies, thinking about the way they do business, how they design and how they deliver plans for their clients, by the power companies. So whether it's SSE or Scottish Power or many different power companies, they all have routes to net zero. And so an example from what engineers are doing now, the Institution of Civil Engineers and the Institution of Structural Engineers, they accredit the programs that we teach on Rwayda, so we're teaching the next generation, and we're already doing our best to try and teach them about sustainable approaches to their science and their engineering and their contribution. But we're going to be required, as part of our accreditation of those courses, we're going to be required to really deliver an understanding of the climate emergency and how to approach it from our professional perspective is going to be a prerequisite for the next set of professional accreditations. So not only are we already doing our best to help these young engineers to hit the ground running, we're going to be required to make them prepared to hit the ground running in the next few years.
So a lot of extra work for you guys as lecturers to refresh all your lecture series, redo all your notes.
A lot of what they're looking for, a department like ours is doing a lot of that already. We've got a program called Civil and Environmental Engineering, so we've got it embedded and threaded throughout, but we're really going to have to make it explicit. We're going to have to assess it. We're going to have to make sure that we, strengthen that component part. And I think that it doesn't just rely on what we already know in the teaching, but it's continuing with the, research projects and things to develop new technologies, so that the actual research side as well as the teaching side is really critical for us, and working with industry partners to think about how we can do things better in all aspects of engineering and all aspects of science, so that our actions in themselves as we're working don't contribute more than they need to the problem, but also that the work that we're doing contributes to the solution. Yeah. So at all levels, whether it's blue sky thinking and research and, horizon scanning, or whether it's boots on the ground now, we need the whole lot.
Oh, I like that you said blue sky thinking, because that's sort of like, that's just, I want to do the science and I want to get into this. I'm not really bothered about an application. I'm curious about something and I want to go and pursue it. That's why I got into science, because I was curious. It wasn't necessarily about solving a problem or designing a new technology, which I think is what a lot of people see science as. But it was more about just being curious. I feel like a lot of that gets missed. But I mean, Rwayda, you're an engineer, right? So
yeah, I'm a more of applied science kind of person. So the science is the curiosity you're talking about, though. Then this curiosity would generate knowledge. So I need to use this knowledge, apply it, and put it into practice. So that's, I think, a main difference between a scientist and an engineer. So we would take the science, we generate new science sometimes, but we mainly take the science from other stuff, implement the science. So for me, civil engineering is a mixture between math and physics. So we need the physics science, we need the math science, we mush them together and get a practical session on how to design something, how to design a bridge out of timber, how to design a bridge out of concrete, or so on. So we use the math and physics, mush them together, and generate an applied science approach to things. So that is more as the science type of stuff that I would deal with, rather than just curiosity, as you mentioned.
So someone like me could think of some mad idea for doing something, and then someone like you can turn that into something practical.
Yeah, I think that's the main thing between a scientist and an engineer. We take what you produce, put that into applied sciences. I think that's why they call us applied sciences. Well, at least this is my point of view on things. People might disagree with that.
I've been part of quite a few engineering schools and departments at universities when I was doing research. So some people think of me as an engineer. I don't think of myself as an engineer.
You do think like an engineer, Laura. That's from my experience with you during the podcast. So you do think like an engineer. I think we have influenced you and added you to our pack.
Good to know.
I think that's part of the problem, guys. I think the fact that we parcel ourselves into these sort of professions and silos and, ways of thinking is exactly part of the problem. We need to get out of that if we're going to solve some of these global challenges. And we need to embrace the blue sky thinking along with the applied solutions. We need to embrace the fact that actually it's not just engineers or just climate scientists that can solve this. We need the political scientists, the social policy people, the behavior change experts, to be able to understand how we can communicate the message and be able to implement what we know. And if it wasn't for blue sky thinking or even blue sky research, we might not have known about the hole in the ozone layer, literally blue sky, research. So somebody had to think, how can we find out what's up there? without disturbing it? How can we sample it? So somebody had to think of, how are we going to get a sample? Where in the world are we going to do it? How do we know if it's representative? Then what do we do with the data? And how long do we need to monitor it for before we understand something about the meaningfulness of those data? Yeah, over the last 50 years, the way in which we've been able to monitor the world, and I think particularly now, thinking about the way we can monitor from space, so remote. So this is really kind of bringing sort of satellite science and technology and physics and, space science and land monitoring into all of this, bringing it all together. So I don't care if you call yourself an engineer or whatever, but somehow we've all managed to work together to get brilliant aerial monitoring of the planet. So from space, we can view a resolution that we could never view before, even the health of wetlands, the migration of species on the planet, the extent to which we have droughts and floods, and where storms are coming from, and how much advance warning we can give people to help reduce the impact of those storms. So, it's really amazing. So we don't need to necessarily think of ourselves as engineers. Maybe we all need to go back to being natural scientists like Alexander von Humboldt or something like that, being these polymaths that can think from all different perspectives. Because on the edges of our disciplines and where we rub against where we think the start of another discipline is, that's often where the sparks fly. Yeah. That's often where the great ideas come from. And maybe that links back to what I was saying about those empathetic leadership discussions. It's about not just thinking in your role as a corporate CEO. It's maybe thinking about your role as a dad and a husband and a grandfather or a mother or a grandmother in that role. And maybe that's the thing that makes you realize your values and gets you to move forward or to listen to the science or to change the way in which you operate on a professional basis. So I realize I've gone a little bit off topic there, but I just wanted to say that it's working across sectors, not in our silos, that's actually going to give us the right solutions.
Yeah,
that's true. That does happen quite a lot in science. People are like, I specialize in this and that's what I'm going to focus on. But I mean, I was laughing because you said we should all be natural sciences. That is what my undergraduate degree started off being called. I started off studying natural sciences, and I just sort of picked all these like kind of random subjects through my career and always spanned across things. But yeah, you're right. It's about identifying like, what is your interest and what can you bring to this, and what solutions can you bring, whether that's blue sky thinking that someone else can act on, or making a new device, or engineering something to be better.
I think also communication could be needed in the set of skills you just mentioned. I just needed to jump in just to say add communication, because if you don't communicate your science, no one would know about it.
That's very true. That's what I used to tell my PhD students all the time. There's no point in you doing something if you can't write it down in your thesis or in a paper that you'll have peer reviewed and published. You can't just do it in isolation. You need to let people know about it so they can also build on it, right? That's what scientists do. They should be building on each other and trying to collaborate. I know there are often differences of viewpoints based on different evidence in science, but I think the climate debate is one where many scientists have come together to say, yes, we're agreed, this is happening, we need to do something. So that sort of brings us back to, there are actions that everyone can take. It's not just about the scientists and engineers who can help with the climate emergency. I think everyone has a role to play.
Like, what do you do if you're not a scientist?
So you can take in that information, right? But then what do you do with it?
Exactly. So, I mean, if you're not a scientist and you're not kind of, contributing in one of those silos that we were just talking about as an engineer or some other kind of professional or a CEO, what can you do? Well, I mean, I think every single one of us has got a power, actually. It's maybe strange to think about it in that way, but every single one of us has got power in this equation. We've got the ability to change the questions that we ask ourselves, to change the ways that we act. So maybe we could, instead of taking a half a mile journey in the car, that's an easy walk or a cycle. And if all of those half-mile journeys or 1 mile journeys were not done with combustion engines, then collectively we'd make a big difference in the world. And equally, we can think about our diet, what we're eating. I mean, there's lots of evidence to say that, if you take red meat out of your diet for 1 or 2 meals a week, that if everybody did that, it would make a huge difference to emissions and to, carbon budgets. And similarly, just little things like maybe not using the washing machine as often. And that brings me to a really funny story, actually, about behaviour change. So, if you're in a hotel, you get the towels and you think, well, that's nice, fluffy towel, use that. And you could put it down on the floor and it'll get washed. But you must all have seen those hotels that have the little sign that says, help us save the environment. Don't put your towel in the wash if you don't need to. Maybe you could use it again, but we're happy to wash it if you want us to wash it. Well, when they first started rolling out that campaign, there was a bit of a study. So this was a social science, a behavior change science study that was done to try and figure out what the most effective message would be to get people to use their towels more than once if they were staying for more than one night. And so they tried out different messages, and in different rooms, they had different messages to see which ones were most effective at changing the laundry. Because every time you have to do more laundry, it's power. So you need energy for the laundry, you need water, and you're potentially polluting the environment because you're using detergents. And probably you're shipping it off in a car to a laundrette somewhere else. So you're using fossil fuels and you're creating emissions. So a really good thing we could do is try and reduce all of that. So what do you think they found out? Was it saving the environment that made people change? Was it saving energy, saving water that made people change their behaviours? No, it was thinking about what other people did. So the message that seemed to change the behaviour the most was to say, 9 out of 10 people that used this room before you have chosen to use their towel for a second day. And so people understanding that they were not doing something different, that they were doing something good, but it was okay because everyone else was doing it too, that helped.
The behavior is contagious. That's what you're saying.
Or maybe just there's that thing about acceptance and people being a bit worried about their behaviors and what's okay and what's not okay and what, might be frowned upon or seen as not being the right thing to do. I think if you have this feeling that other people are doing it too, it's hugely empowering. It gives you that kind of confidence to maybe do it. So yeah, we all do have power. And I think actually that lovely story about the towels actually just reminds me that if we talk about climate actions that we're taking as individuals, it becomes okay for your neighbour or your friend or person on the bus that you speak to through your mask. It becomes okay for them to do those actions too, because they realise that, first of all, they might not realise they could do it. And second of all, they realise that other people around them are doing those actions. So you don't have to be a scientist or an engineer or a CEO to make a difference. Every single one of us can make a difference towards these targets. And you certainly don't have to go to COP and take part in negotiations to make a difference.
No. Funny you should say about those signs in hotel rooms for towels, because I've been seeing those for well over 10 years now, well before there was all this talk about the climate summits and various other things, so that I can remember anyway. And I always thought, yeah, I want to do that. I want to do the thing with the towels. And every time I hung my towel up on the hook so I could reuse it rather than putting it on the floor, it would still get washed.
Yeah.
And I got so annoyed at it getting washed when I didn't want it to.
Yeah, I have the same experience with the hotel. Sometimes I hide my towel underneath the pillow so it won't get washed, and they find it.
I guess that's their job. They're there to make sure everything is clean and as the hotel says it should be, unless someone else says otherwise.
My towel is not on the floor.
No.
I think, it's funny, isn't it? And I think maybe something like COP26 and all the press it's getting, maybe, and, just listening to the radio occasionally, if I went through to get a cup of tea or a bit of lunch today while I was working, all of the radios, the talk shows on the Radio 4, different radio stations, Radio Scotland, they all seem to have, a topic around climate change. And it's very much in the public forum at the moment. And I think the more that it becomes a normal thing to talk about and to discuss and to realise is important, then hopefully, it won't be about trying to stop people from washing your towels if you don't want them to. It'll be about, well, you don't get your towel washed unless you absolutely ask for it, because we all know it will become common sense, common knowledge, common practice.
Yeah, I think it will become more aware. Social awareness is the word for it.
Yeah, I mean, just a general awareness. And I think, people are beginning to demand it. So there was a study that came out last week, I think, from Natural England, and it said that 80% of young people wanted to do more to protect the planet. Now, all of those young people have got parents, and all of those young people are going to be going through school, they're going to be going into work experience, they're going to be going into uni. You've got 80%, that is a large majority of that youth population that is already aware of the need to do something. So I don't think that they'll be, if they go into work for these hotels and things like that, they might not necessarily be picking up those towels and putting them in the wash, because they already have that perspective of wanting to do something. So I have huge hope, although there's still a lot of negotiations to be had. There's a lot of agreements and conversations and voting and all the rest of it to be had. And there's some doubts about the success of COP26. I don't think it's in the bag yet, but I've got hope.
It's interesting you mentioned this study about the 80% of the younger generation, because a few weeks back in Dundee, we had the giant storm, and I was listening to the kids talking, and all the children and the kids were talking about how this giant buffet is made of the stuff that the sea spelled out, and how they should not throw stuff near the sea, on the sea, and put the stuff in the bin instead. It was not only one kid. Like, it was, I listened to a few random conversation. I overheard it when I was moving around, and it seems all the kids are very aware that is pollution is a huge issue that is threatening the sea and the sea creatures, and they need to protect that. So that aligns quite very well with what you said there about the study.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we don't make the change within our teaching, we'll be behind the curve, Rwayda. You know, this is the time, this is what the kids are expecting us to be teaching front and center, you know, when they come into a degree program like us. So we have to step up, you know, it's our responsibility. It's one of the things, one of the powers that we have is to do that more and to do it better, you know, on behalf of the next generation, because they need to have the skills and the knowledge to hit the ground running. They are not going to be able to hang about and wait till somebody else does something. So we need to help them.
I feel like this could be like the script of a film, where like the students are coming in and telling the lecturers how it is and what they should be doing, and telling them they're doing things wrong.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, we have to be agile, we have to move with the times. And, you know, I mean, it's important, isn't it? I mean, I was at that same event that Rwayda was just talking about. It was a COP26 celebration event in Dundee. And they had this big puppet, 10 meters tall, made out of recycled. And I was actually running a public science communication event there, where I had a house and rain gardens, and I was explaining nature-based solutions and the way in which it relates to my research, thinking about getting multiple benefits from the way in which we engineer the environment for managing water, but also for biodiversity, carbon capture, and all the rest of it. There was so much interest from young people, from parents, from teachers who came along that wanted to know, you know, could we do this in our schoolyard? Can we do this in our backyard? So there was just a tremendous amount of interest. So I would absolutely support what Rwayda said about, you know, overhearing those conversations about that interest that there is, particularly among young people. And, you know, our teachers are responding, we're lecturers, we're responding, the professions are responding. So that's what gives me hope. I do have hope, and I do have a lot of optimism. But I also, you know, do have a practical and realistic head on my shoulders as well. And I know that there's still hurdles to overcome. And let's just hope that the COP26 negotiations can overcome those political and socioeconomic hurdles to help us all head in the right direction. Because the sooner we do it, the better it'll be.
Yeah, let's hope so. I'll see some more positive actions that will lead to a brighter future, I guess.
Yeah, so nature-based solutions, it's so critical. I mean, I think that these nature-based solutions are working with nature and natural processes. So there was a study published in Nature, the Nature as in the scientific journal, in May of this year. And it suggested that working with nature-based solutions could basically have a 10 gigaton carbon equivalent difference. So 5 gigatons would be about avoided emissions, because we were putting nature there rather than something else that would otherwise have had emissions. And 5 gigatons of that would be about carbon sequestration. So because we've worked with nature and vegetation, it takes in carbon and it stores carbon. But that 10 gigatons is equivalent to all of the global transport emissions. So nature-based solutions, using plants, thinking about inclusive blue and green infrastructure. So it's still infrastructure. So we're engineering nature, but we're using nature and we're working with natural processes. It's really applied sort of landscape and engineering science. So you're getting functional engineering benefits, but you're also getting biodiversity and all sorts of good health benefits and things like that. Never mind the carbon, never mind the carbon equation, but just the carbon equation on its own. 10 gigatons is equal to all of the global transport emissions. So, I mean, it is incredible to think about that. And, maybe it's something that might be of interest just for another day.
Yeah, I think it would be, because it also sort of suggests we can carry on doing what we're doing and nature will take care of it, which I don't think is really the right way of looking at it, because human activity got us into the situation we're in, and human activity should really get us out of it. And it'll take a mixture of things, so working with nature and also engineering our own technologies to just do things better.
I mean, we might have some really high-tech sort of, carbon-sucking technology next to a rain garden, and they're both doing a great thing for the carbon challenge, but they're doing it in different ways. So we're going to need all of that. We're going to need the high-tech innovations. We're going to need the stuff that we haven't even invented yet. But what we can't do at COP is we can't rely on the stuff that we haven't even invented yet. We can't promise actions that aren't practicable. So I think that's what it's really going to boil down to.
Yeah, so I guess we'll be watching what the outcome of the negotiations is, because if they do decide to then go down the route of technology that isn't there yet, I'll be very disappointed, I guess.
But in the meantime, we need to keep developing that technology. So what we're saying is we can't rely on it to get to 2030 or maybe even mid-century, but maybe beyond then, if we've got technology readiness for these new ideas, then maybe they can become part of the equation when actually we've done all the stuff that we can do now and we need other solutions to help us out going forward. So yeah, we have to do that blue sky thinking, horizon scanning, new technology. It's definitely part of the bigger picture.
All those different approaches to how you do science and what science means to you. Yeah, I think that was a really good sort of summing up then as well of what COP26 can achieve if the negotiations go as well as they could. So it sounds like we're sort of saying there are loads of things that science and engineering is doing to help with the climate emergency. It's in all that modelling that you mentioned. We've gone into space and looked at what the planet is doing. You mentioned those nature-based solutions that I think could probably be an episode in their own right, because they sound really interesting and probably quite complex to figure out, because I'm used to working in the lab where you can control quite a lot of your variables, but going out into nature to do it, that's a whole different ballgame. So maybe we could pick that up in a future episode. I think COP26, it's also a great example of how scientists and engineers influence national policies. And so they're decided by various governments, right? So that's a very practical example of how science and engineering makes a difference to the world.
Yeah, and of course, we vote in our governments, right? So if we've got 80% of kids wanting to do something better for the planet, I wonder what the voting pattern's going to look like in a few years' time. So those governments are, they're elected by us for the most part around the world, not always, but certainly in the UK, we have an elected government. So they ought to be doing what their constituents want them to do, right? So maybe what we want them to do is going to change a bit as well, and that's going to influence policy in the future.
Yeah, start influencing your MPs.
It's another power that we all have. Yeah.
Yeah, use that science and get out there and influence.
Yeah.
And we also talked about how science can help predict the future. So it could explain what will happen if we don't take action. And I think that's really important. So again, use those predictions to go out there and influence people. We also mentioned a little bit about how it could develop new technologies, and again, about how it can help us work with nature. So two very different things, new tech, working with nature. You've mentioned social science, but it can also help us change our habits, which I think is probably the greatest challenge, because I know I have some very bad habits and I've tried to break them. And I'm still doing them, not necessarily climate related ones, but bad habits do exist and they are difficult to change. So on that very weird note to end a podcast episode on, I think I'll leave it there. So if you want to have any comments about any of this, if you're listening, whether it's about my own habits or your habits or something else, you can find us on Twitter, or you can leave a comment on this episode, or you can email us.
The views expressed in this podcast belong entirely to the person that said them. They do not represent any industry or organisation. If you enjoyed listening to these views, it would really help us out if you could rate us, leave a review and tell a friend. This podcast was sponsored by no one, but if you're interested in funding us to continue to have frank discussions about science and engineering, please get in touch.